Hi, I'm Yulia, and this is Burning Questions. And the topic that has been setting the internet on fire in the past, not even a week, but a couple of months, I would say, is what has really happened in Kursk? Was it a success, and why did Ukraine even go there? And today we have Caolan Robertson with us to answer that question.
My name's Caolan Robertson. I'm a reporter based full-time here in Kyiv. I'm from Ireland, and I document what Russia's doing to this country all across the front lines.
And Kaelin also has been to Kursk, which is an opportunity very few journalists and people in general had the chance to have while Kursk was temporarily occupied by the Ukrainian military. And there was a documentary that was recently released by the Armed Forces of Ukraine about what had happened in Kursk, kind of like what people think on the ground, sort of the realities of this war and the realities of kind of how the Russian people are fooled by the Russian government. So I'm very curious as to like what your experiences were as compared to those from the documentary. And before we get into that, what was like, how did you get into Kursk?
I got in during a very complicated time. I was not planning on going to Kursk. I was doing a documentary from Kramatorsk all the way up to Sumy, delivering drones to frontline units. But when I got to Sumy, I had heard word that the counteroffensive had started in Kursk. This is when the North Koreans were suspected to have arrived. And it was when North Korean troops were apparently on the ground and just when a lot of activity was happening. And at this point, it was extremely hard to get access. You know, volunteers, NGOs, no one was really getting in. And one of the soldiers from one of the amazing units there met me and said, "Do you want to go to Kursk?" And I said, "Sure." He said, "Okay, I'll pick you up at 9 a.m. tomorrow and I'll take you in." It was not something I was sort of expecting to do. It's not something I really wanted to do because I knew a couple of friends who had been, and it seemed like literally the most terrifying thing ever. And obviously Russia sanctions everyone that goes in. So I didn't really have time to process what it was, but I just said, yes, it felt like the right thing to do. And I wanted to see if the counteroffensive had begun and what was happening with North Korean troops. And so I got picked up in the morning and we went and we crossed the border into Russia. It was my first time in Russia and my first time going somewhere without a passport to another country, which is kind of cool. But it was really dramatic. But it wasn't the type of dramatic that the Kremlin's putting out. The locals there were treated pretty well. I mean, we can get into all of this later, but I put out my documentary recently and not at the time because Russia has only recently just started to put out massive propaganda about Kursk, that it was a failure and that there were war crimes carried out. And the footage that I gathered, I was like, hold on a second, this is the complete opposite of what is coming out of the Kremlin. This is the complete opposite of what is coming out of Russia. So I felt like it was a good time to put it out. But it was extremely dramatic. And what Russia did, because I went there and I took a sort of a selfie, and I was very, I like to annoy Russian propagandists because they hate being humiliated because, I don't know, that's like their Achilles heel. Russian propagandists just can't stand to be laughed at. And I sort of said, I heard that Russia was a shithole, so I went to figure out for myself if it was, and I realized it was actually a shithole, but at least the locals now had flushing toilets from the Ukrainians. And I think that triggered something because of the 20 journalists that went there, I'm the only one that they put on the super, super, super serious international wanted list where they would properly extradite, where, they had a court proceeding with my picture printed out in a Kursk courtroom. So I think it really upset them.
Did they put did they put a little voodoo doll of you in the court as well? A little stand-in Kaelin?
They might have. I remember it was really weird finding out about the court case because I woke up one morning in February, I think it was the 11th of February, and I was like, I wonder whatever happened to my Kursk thing, whether there was a press release or what happened, because none of the other journalists had a big press release.
Yeah.
And I just typed in my name in Russian into Google, and it was Russia Today, TASS, all the different things saying, it was so kind of really dramatic. But I mean, it struck a chord, it upset them, and Russians hate to be laughed at. Their country is a joke, and they don't like people laughing at the fact it's a joke. So it's good. It's good for all of us to join in and have a good laugh at the Russians.
Yeah, Russians really don't like to be made fun of. I think the difference is that most journalists like posted about Kursk in a very like serious sort of, politically correct kind of like newsy manner, and you were just kind of like, ha, I wanted to go and see if it's a shithole. It is a shithole. Like, sorry, hate it here.
No, but it did deserve to be laughed at
Yeah.
because Russians were so upset about the idea that someone like me, a journalist, would cross their border, would not take their borders seriously when they have literally done this to every single country that is their neighbor. They did it to Georgia, they did it to Crimea. Like, they don't give a shit about borders. Yet when someone crosses, so I mean, it is a joke, and it is something to be laughed at how ridiculous and satirical Russian policy is, everything to do with it. So that's kind of the point of posting the way that I posted. It wasn't to really get a reaction out of them. It was to basically say how ridiculous this situation is, that this is somehow an absolute crime against humanity to betray the borders of a country when they've been steaming across the borders here for years.
I mean, it's also funny, right? Because they don't care about their own country or their own territories, and we're going to get into that with what was happening in Kursk and what Russia was doing there. Yet, if you cross their sacred border, it's a problem. So, before we get into this, what do you think the objective of the Ukrainian offensive on Kursk was, and do you think the Ukraine accomplished it?
I've heard a lot of different voices inside Ukraine, outside Ukraine, over what the point of Kursk was. Whether it was to ease up pressure in different parts of the front line, whether it was to go further and take over power plants. I genuinely think after everything I've seen, it was to show the world that Ukraine isn't weak, and it succeeded in that. Russia has been putting out propaganda since 2022 that Ukraine can't win this war. That's all they really have, because Russia actually can't win this invasion. So they want to convince everyone else in Europe that this country is weak, that this country is pathetic, that this country can't fight back, and this country isn't worth supporting. Kursk, the fact that this country took and held Russian territory for 8 months, the fact that Putin had to call up failed states like North Korea and Iran for a backup, shows that Russia isn't as strong as we thought it was, and Ukraine is far stronger than we think it is on the world stage. And that's what it succeeded in. And regardless of any other analysis, that is point blank a fact. And that's why I think Kursk was a fantastic operation, because a lot of people, a lot of analysts, a lot of governments might have been pondering, is Ukraine worth supporting? Is Ukraine worth defending? Can Ukraine hold its ground? Can Ukraine defend its own country? Well, they managed to hold Russian ground for 8 months. They can probably look after themselves. So it had that political point, and it worked. And that's why so much of the propaganda now coming out from Kursk is focused on all of these narratives of this sort of weak retreat. We went through these sewer tunnels and we took them up. Surrender. They didn't want to fight anymore. They dropped their weapons. They ran like rats. I watched the Russia Today report broadcast the second they took back Sudzha, and it was like, they ran like rats. They were, they were weak. They were, and it was all about that, because that is the opposite of what the message that Kursk created was, which was that Ukraine is strong.
Well,
and it was successful in that. I mean, even if,
it was kind of funny, actually, when they started saying that Ukraine just couldn't hold ground. That's why they surrendered and ran away, and that Ukraine just broke through into Belgorod instead, which was kind of like, which was a very funny little comeback. Like, I don't think anyone was actually planning on doing that. They saw the opportunity and they were like, yeah, I mean, let's do this. Why not? We're so weak and incompetent that we just
within seconds as well. There wasn't even a pause. It was like while the Ukrainians were coming out of Kursk, they were literally deploying new troops. It's actually very iconic.
I thought it was quite hilarious, because it was for me, the way that it happened is I saw all of these Russian propaganda reports on Twitter and all the bots like spreading the message, and it was quite funny because in between those there would be news about Ukraine breaking through into Belgorod. So it would be like, Ukraine's troops surrender and are surrounded in Kursk, and Russia just like, I don't know, smoked them out of there. It's like, Ukrainian troops are breaking into Belgorod. Like, Ukrainian troops are weak and they can't accomplish anything. They just had to like lay down their weapons. Like, Ukraine just launched a counteroffensive onto Belgorod, and it was just a very funny way to,
It's always. I mean, I watch Russian propaganda all the time, because one of the things I focus on most prominently now is combating it. And watching how Americans are now repeating it all. But Adam Curtis spoke about this years ago, hypernormalization. It's like, no one really believes anything in Russia because the news is completely contradictory and it's madness. And it's why everyone is in a sort of state of psychosis in that country. Because they don't know what to believe anymore. So but it's honestly, it's hilarious and iconic behavior for the Ukrainians to have done that.
I mean, it's by
in Kursk.
design, obviously. It's overwhelmed with information, right, to the point where no one can believe anything. It doesn't matter if it's contradicting. It doesn't matter if it makes no sense. That's the point, and that's what they're doing in the U.S. today. That's what I'm seeing in the U.S. But I want to come back to something that you said about the Russian borders being sacred and how they are so upset about someone disrespecting their borders and not taking them seriously. Meanwhile, from what I've seen in the documentary and what I've heard quite a bit, right, is that Russia completely bombed Sudzha to the ground, similarly to what they did with Severodonetsk, similarly to what they did with other Ukrainian cities, in order to smoke Ukrainian military out of there. So it's such an interesting parallel where, you know, they absolutely do not care about that land, but they care about you caring about that land. It's almost like, you know, bullies in school, right? It's kind of like they don't necessarily care for what they're doing or for what they're doing to you. It's just they want respect. And that's it.
Yeah. Which is why the humiliation works so well for Russians, because that's all they have. They don't have a functional country. 50% of rural areas in Russia don't have flushing toilets. They know that their country is dysfunctional. There's no democracy and free speech. All they have is a false image of that. And anything that threatens that is a threat to your entire identity, which is great. It's great. But also about bombing Sudzha as well. I mean, one of the first reports that came out said that Ukrainians had, you know, destroyed all these houses and murdered all these civilians. If you look at my footage from Kursk, direct on the ground footage, Ukrainians had already held that region for 5 months by the time that I got there. And all those houses that are now destroyed were still intact because Ukrainians hadn't destroyed them. In fact, the Ukrainian troops that I was looking at and that I was with weren't even based there. They were basically based in and around Sumy, and they were going to Kursk every single day, going to Sudzha every single day, so that those houses wouldn't get bombed. And the residents inside those houses could continue living in their homes. So Russia destroyed their own towns and cities to take them back. And that's something they've been denying the whole time. But again, my footage has direct documentary evidence that shows the opposite of it. And the documentary that we're talking about today that you showed me, that the armed forces have made, shows that too. All those buildings were intact right up until the Russians decided they'd had enough and decided to bomb their own towns and cities, which is also quite ironic because they tried to take this city in 2022, and 3 years later they're bombing their own cities. But it's just lies, and it's easily disproved. Again, the residents weren't cowering in fear in Sudzha as well. I mean, they were greeting us. I spoke to them in the supermarkets that they were looting, their own supermarkets, and they were like happy with all the aid that they'd been given. There were children on bicycles cycling through the streets. You know, there wasn't a genocide being carried out by the Ukrainians, but this is also one of the reasons I went, because Russian narratives are taking over right now, and they're being repeated by the White House. And the only way you can really counter it is to physically go to these places and capture it with a camera and upload it to the internet. So I'm glad that I did, and I'm glad that the film that we watched last night, that we're talking about today, captured that too.
Yeah, well,
But it's just lies.
you know, one of the things that also like kind of struck a chord with me in that film is that, well, you said that Ukrainians didn't destroy anything, right? So at the time at which Ukrainians came into Sudzha, there was no running water, and there were, I think they brought a massive generator. The Ukrainian troops brought a massive generator into Sudzha that actually powered the water supply to houses. So it's kind of like living conditions were improved by Ukrainian troops. Quite a few
Yes.
elderly people, because there was a lot of footage of combat medics coming in and sort of like trying to see, you know, because when there was shelling, like people would get hurt and stuff, and they would start prescribing them medication for illnesses that these elderly people didn't even know they had, because they have literally never gotten medical attention before, and they were like being taken care of, and they were just like gushing about how well they're being taken care of, and all of this like medicine and all of these supplies they're getting, and all of these like illnesses they're being diagnosed with. And it was such a surreal thing. There was a part of this documentary that I was just kind of like mind blown about, where the Ukrainian military noticed that Russia is obviously bombing its own churches, right? And of course, the Russian Orthodox Church is a propaganda mechanism that heavily focuses on discrediting Ukraine and spreading the Russian world. However, the Ukrainian military went into these churches, organized like team leaders and elders in order to pack up all of these gold-encrusted, tacky Russian Orthodox Church things So the thing that like really struck me in Sudzha was that, you know, Ukrainians figured that Russia is bombing its own Orthodox churches, obviously, because like there is nothing holy. And they went to the churches to see if like, you know, someone had preserved all of the paraphernalia, and they saw that no one did anything. And all of these like, you know, super tacky gold encrusted Russian Orthodox church paraphernalia was just exposed. And if, you know, a bomb were to go off, like all of that would be lost. And so the Ukrainian military went and organized team leaders and elders to come to these churches and pack up all of the stuff. And when asked why they're doing that, they're like, well, I mean, it's culture, right? Like we might not agree with it, but it's cultural relics and stuff. And we are sure it's important to them, or at least should be, so it should be preserved. And I was standing there and I was like, so you want to tell me that you went to a place to a church that basically propagates the murder of you and blesses tanks to come murder you, and you were impartial enough to look at all of these symbols that legitimately speak for killing you and killing us, and you packed it up nicely and wrapped it up and put it in a basement so it would be preserved? I mean, I don't think I could do that, you know?
There's a fundamental difference between Ukraine and Russia, and well, there's a million different differences, and that is one of the best visual examples of it. It's one country cares about culture, regardless of whose culture it is, preservation, and even if it's however it's intended, doing the right thing and preserving that church. We can disagree on whether that's the right thing or not, but one country, and this is why propaganda is so infuriating against Ukraine, is also a Christian nation. I mean, this is a very diverse country. Ukraine has lots of different religions and people that aren't religious, but it's far more Christian and moral based than Russia. And Russia puts out these ideas all the time, every single day, that they're Mr. Based Putin, Mr. Christian based, based nation you've ordered. This is like the idea that they export around the world. And the only country that is preserving churches are Ukrainians inside Russia, when the Ukrainians are actually perfectly justified to blow those churches to hell. Ukrainians are justified to be pretty outraged by everything to do with Russia.
Yeah.
And that wasn't a PR stunt as well. This is within the Ukrainian spirit to actually preserve things that are good. And it's an opposite mentality. And what's so annoying about that propaganda is it's genuinely working, and it's the complete opposite of what Ukraine is. I mean, Russia bombed the church in Odessa. Russia tortured priests in Kherson, priests that I spoke to. Russia have destroyed churches in this city, the facades of churches in November. They do not give a shit about Christianity or churches or anything to do with religion or morality.
Well,
This country does. That's why they packaged everything up and put it in the basement in Sudzha.
Yeah, that's, I mean, like, to me, it was like kind of eye-opening, right? Like, I'm Ukrainian, but I don't know if I could go to a church that I know propagates the Russian world, look at all of the stuff and be like, oh, yes, I want to preserve that. So that's like, I command that, right? Because I don't know if I would have made that decision in the moment. But interestingly, like, all of the people from that city, they were coming to that church and looking at this drive of preserving and wrapping things into like cardboard boxes, and they were like, oh, right. The Christian nation. So no one even thought about the church. All of the chaplains from the church, or all of the priests, they fled from within the first day, and there was one guy left, and he was just kind of like lost. I mean, he looked very, he definitely is part of the church. Like, he had the beard and everything, and he was talking about how all the priests just like left their church and all of their constituents, and how he stayed sort of because he couldn't evacuate, and he was just kind of like lost, walking around there and helping the Ukrainian military preserve what he is supposed to be devoted to, because he works for the church, right? And it was very interesting, especially it's interesting when Russia is being shown as this like beacon of Christianity and Christian values, when Putin has like 7 lovers or something like that and a bunch of bastard children. He's divorced. And there is just, it's just quite insane.
Because everything that Russia puts out is the opposite of what it is. And the fact that priests fled straight away, I mean, this is because any sort of religious facade that exists in Russia is in costume only. Like, whenever Putin goes to a ceremony in Russia, it's wearing costumes and shaking hands with priests who have nothing to do with Christianity. And that's why their outfits are so over the top in camp as well. It's like a drag queen version of a priest. East. I mean, it's like a ridiculous, like a ridiculous over-the-top show. But it's also why it's also because Russia isn't a strong country. Like when we were coming under fire from Graz, we were in Sudzha, we ran into one of the houses that door was open. And it happened to be the chief of police's house because his jacket was there with all the logos on it. And that house had been fled from. Everything was, the fridge door was open. Everything was poured all over the floor. And he had just ran because Russians don't even want to fight for their own country. That's why they have to pull Russians out of asylum centers and mental, hospitals and prisons to put them on the front line because even the chief of police doesn't want to defend their own town. Whereas in Mariupol and in all the areas that became occupied and in Kherson, every police officer took up a gun and fought against the Russians because they actually care about something. And that's the fundamental difference between both sides. One side actually knows what it's fighting for, and one side wants to run like rats, like what Russia claims Ukraine is. But yeah, I'm glad that I went, though, and captured all of this because there weren't many reports like I had made, and like the film we're talking about now, the documentary, that really showed what it was like. Most of it was written pieces and a lot of it was just photography. But to actually see it captured and see it for what it was is a direct affront to what Russia's putting out about it.
Well, it was very interesting because in that film, basically, as these events were happening over the 8 months, right, the Ukrainian military would come in and show, because you could see like the same faces. It's like some of the families they check up on all the time, and they were invited to this little girl's birthday. So yes, occupiers, scary occupiers came to a 5-year-old's birthday on her mom's invitation and brought her a tutu. Like, come on, But one of the things that was interesting is that they would bring in the news, like the news from Russia, and show these Russians in Sudzha what the Russian propaganda is saying about Sudzha. And these people were sitting there and being like, they're fucking morons. Like, this is not what's happening, They would talk about how Ukrainians are torturing people, how, the funniest thing was the contradiction, right? It was like, okay, so on day one, they said there were no Russians left in Sudzha because everybody obviously immediately went to Russia and crossed, and fled and whatever, because why would they ever want to be with the Nazi Ukrainians? Then they started saying that Ukrainians are committing war crimes and torturing the people and residents of Sudzha that I thought were not there. Then when the Ukrainians requested a humanitarian corridor to get those people evacuated because all of their houses have been destroyed and they're on public school number 3, in terms of keeping people in one space and giving them shelter. Russia was saying that, again, there are no civilians left in Sudzha and there is no point in doing a humanitarian corridor. We just need to destroy the entirety of the city in order to get the Ukrainians out. The Ukrainians were like, what the hell? Then Russia started carpet bombing the city, and suddenly it was Ukrainians carpet bombing the Russian civilians. And I'm just like, okay, so there were no Russian civilians, Ukrainian war crimes against Russian civilians, humanitarian corridor, no Russian civilians, carpet bombing Sudzha, Russian civilians. Ukrainians are committing war crimes against Russia. Which is it? Which is it?
But Russia doesn't. Which is funny, but Russia has never cared about their own civilians. I mean, there have been protests, even recently, of civilians in places like Mariupol, Russians in Mariupol, and in brand new apartment buildings that are literally holding up placards and making videos saying, there is no toilets in this building, there's no electricity in this building. They have no regard for any of their own citizens. But what's interesting is the civilians that I interviewed, the Russians, and spoke to, some of them have actually appeared in Russian propaganda now, and they look like they're under duress, right? When I spoke to them, the military that I was with didn't pressure them to speak to me. They were just looting their own supermarkets, right? I went up to them and I spoke to them, and they were happily talking about the reality, which is that life is actually a little bit better under Ukrainian control. And
well,
if you
also
look at the exact same interviews that are happening,
well, it's also because
they look terrified.
There is no what is it, money is not a currency, so they can go to supermarkets and get clothes finally because they couldn't afford a lot of stuff before. So I get that it might not be
because one of the guys was I said, what are you doing here? And he was like, oh, I'm looking for a bread basket. I've always needed a bread basket, so I've come to look for one. It's absolutely surreal, weird, but it's also this is like a luxury item to to Russians.
Yeah.
But if you look at the same interviews now, it's like under duress, right? They're actually more scared now, back under Russian control, because they're all like, God, we gave interviews that were actually talking honestly about our situation. And they're actually, genuinely, the Russians that lived in Sudzha are now under more threat to their life back under Russian control because they spoke the truth about what it was like. And that's what's crazy. So that's what liberation is, you know, for Russia.
Exactly. It was interesting because the Ukrainian military actually asked, they were like, you know, like, are you scared of us? And they're like, no, we're scared of our own. And that was like a big, you know, a big situation. Also, I liked the aspect of that documentary where the Ukrainian military sort of took the Mstislav Chernov 20 days in Mariupol route, right? Where they didn't ask them like, oh, do you know that Russians are bombing you? They would be like, oh, there was a cluster bomb. Do you know who did that?
Yes.
And they would be like, oh, our military did that. You know, as in like, it wasn't, they weren't asking any navigational questions because they didn't want, they wanted it to be like as organic as possible. So it's very evident that they're not putting these thoughts into their head. And then another thing that like, it was like a very small subplot, but there was this man named Mykola who was living in near Sudzha somewhere in like a village. His daughter lives in Sumy and he has a Ukrainian passport. He's Ukrainian, like ethnically, whatever. He has a Ukrainian last name, Ukrainian name. He speaks like a version of Surzhyk and stuff like that. And I think he was just living in a village near the Russian border and then met his wife and sort of like crossed the border and stayed living on the Russian territory. And so his wife died and she was buried near their like home in like the Sudzha area. And at the time at which everything was destroyed around and his home included, he kind of built like a bunker basement similar to like where soldiers sleep in the trenches, right? And he was living there. And so the Ukrainian military kept coming and being like, hey, dude, like you have a Ukrainian passport, let us evacuate you because, you know, you like there is nothing around you and they keep bombing you and like you're gonna die. And he was like, no, I'm not gonna leave my land. My wife is buried here. And that was the only person throughout the entire documentary, a Ukrainian, that I have heard mention land as like home and as like, you know, I can't leave because my whole life has been here and my wife is here and everything. And, you know, the Ukrainian military was like, but your daughter is in Sumy.
Interesting.
Yeah, but your daughter is in Sumy. And he's like, well, but I'm not going to leave my wife, you know, and it was this
Which is actually quite an interesting...
Yeah, it's an interesting parallel because all of the people in Sudzha, and I get it, like you're being bombed, right? But they're all like asking for a humanitarian corridor to flee somewhere into Russia, right? Somewhere else. They don't care, like obviously they're bummed and their homes are ruined and they have no money and like their entire routine is now screwed. But none of them are talking about like the fact that, oh, my native village is no longer exists, or like, oh, all of my memories are gone. It's just kind of like, it's scary to live in a war. It's scary to live in being bombed, right? But like, hey, let us go somewhere else in Russia where we're not going to be bombed. And this one man who is literally Ukrainian is like, no, it's my land. I'm going to stand on it. I'm 70 years old. I've lived a life. My wife is buried here.
Which is actually an insight into, the difference between Ukrainians and Russians, because he has that mindset, not because he loves Russia and loves Sudzha, but because that is within the psyche of Ukrainians, valuing your land, your country, your people. When I interviewed a woman in Kherson under fire, I said, why don't you leave? And she said, my sister told me to get a passport, but I won't take it because my husband is buried here and my brother is buried here and this is my land. And he's almost taken that Ukrainian part of himself and applied it to Russia. Whether that's, you know, it's fascinating. But if you look at the interviews that Russia Today put out, the second they took back Sudzha, it's exactly what you're saying. It's complaints that there wasn't enough running water during the last bit of bombardment. It's that there was loud noises and they couldn't sleep. It's not our place, our home was taken, our ancestral land was, you know, it's like someone complaining to HR, right?
Yeah.
With their list of problems in their building. It's ridiculous.
But it's also because, like, to be fair, until Russia started bombing Russia, like, I don't know what they had to complain about. They were getting bread daily, they were getting groceries, they were getting medical checkups, they were getting like a place to sleep, movies, they were being like spoken to, like, you know, those old ladies that don't get like human contact or interaction because they just like live in a remote place without a car. Yeah, they had like people in a room with them, you know, like talking to them. They started having running water because there was a literal generator that Ukrainians brought from Ukraine, and it was such a funny moment because the cameraman is like, oh, how many, like how many houses will this generator power? And like this dude turns around and goes, it's gonna power the entirety of Sudzha with water. And these people were like, they're like running water. Oh my God. So it's kind of like you have nothing to, yeah.
That's why I was so shocked that they were happy to speak to me, because I was like, Jesus, I'm going into Russia and speaking to Russian civilians as like an Irish person. I mean, what the hell are they going to think? They're going to hate me for, coming into the territory. But they were receptive. They were waving. They were really happy. They were genuinely, you could clearly see they were genuinely happier under the armed forces of Ukraine. And I'm an objective journalist. I'm not paid by the Ukrainian government, nothing like this. This is like my absolute journalistic observation. That is what I saw.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's the fact.
No, it's like it's a very interesting thing. Like I think like the conclusion that I also gathered from this documentary is that they're so oblivious. First of all of them start their sentences with "I don't care about politics" or "I don't know about politics" or "politics is not my thing," right? Which is of course a typical Russian response, right? But then the more you listen to them, the more you actually understand that they not only do not understand politics, they know nothing of what's going on around them. This one woman, and it was both like comedic and terrifying at the same time. She's speaking to a Ukrainian military commander, and she's like, listen, I'm not trying to like kiss your ass or anything, but like we're against Putin here, like everyone I know in the Sudzha region, like we don't like Putin. We really don't like him, you might kill me for saying this, and I don't know like what your strategy is or like whether you will or not, like I don't know you, but we would like the Belarusian batka to be our president. Like Lukashenko. And she proceeds to talk about how he cares about the Belarusian people and how like she's seen like clips from Belarus and stuff, and I'm just sitting there and I'm like, he is the puppet of your dictator that you don't like, supposedly. I died. It was like it was the best summary of the Russian understanding of like life or curiosity about anything. It's just sort of like, oh, on TV now, I see Putin lies. Bad Putin don't like Putin, right? But on the same TV, I see Lukashenko. I cannot confirm he lies. I like it. Let's do it. And it's kind of like, I'm sorry.
This is what we're dealing with here, though. This is the people we're dealing with. I mean, this is what it's like in the mentality of Russia. It's why things are so dysfunctional and fucked up there. Honestly, it is bizarre land. Everything is upside down, and there's no fixing it as well. Like there's so many conversations about, what should Russia do? Russia should disarm this and this. This is only going to happen when the entity that is Russia is changed forever, and whether it's destroyed as a state or balkanized, I don't know what it is, but as an entity in its current form, peace on earth will only exist when it is completely fundamentally different to what it is now. Well,
because the conclusion of all of it, right, is that like it all comes down to land, but not in the way that NATO is like trying to pose it, or Trump is trying to pose it, or Putin is trying to pose it, right? It comes down to the value of land, because land for Russia is resources. Land for Russians is just a place to live, right? Like if they are put on a different land that Russia has just taken and added to their empire, they're happy to be there because it's just land to live on. Land for Ukrainians is people and memories and roots and culture and ancestors and everything, right? It's an experience. Land is belonging and land is experience. Land for Russia is just land mass. And I mean both for politicians and for people. Because again, like if Lviv was destroyed today, it's not like I'd be happy to move to a different city and just like give me money and put me in a different house. Like I would be devastated because it's my entire world of like growing up being not there anymore. But I feel like for Russians, it's just sort of like, well, okay, again, bummer. It's like, there is no house. As in like they're upset about like these normal things of like, hey, I don't have an apartment anymore. I have nowhere to live. I'm homeless and all of this stuff, right? But it's not about the life that they've had on that land. And I think that's a very good...
Because it's about values. I mean, I saw this in the Carpathians. This is why I made my last documentary about culture, because some of the most ancient culture that exists in this country exists in the mountains of the Carpathians.
Yeah.
Beautiful, distinct. And the values that Ukrainians have are values that Europe has lost in a lot of ways, that the world has lost through the internet, through social media. And it's the values of your neighbor and of the soil of the country you're born in. I mean, it's distinct and it's beautiful. But yeah, Russians want to take Odessa because they see it as a seaside resort. Ukrainians want to hold on to Odessa because it's a fucking ancient, stunning
Cradle
city
of culture,
that's been influenced
yeah.
by every part of Europe.
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
It's
these
like-
are the fundamental values.
Yeah, for us, it's about culture. For them, it's about making money and what they can get out of it. Yeah. Well,
Yes.
thank you so much for having this conversation with me, and thank you for talking about your insights into Sudzha. I'm sure it was a very wild experience and not on your bucket list. But
Yes, it was pretty wild, actually. One of my most crazy holidays.
I would think so. I would think so. But all right, well, thanks. I love having you here as per usual, and I hope I'll have you here sometime soon again. Well, I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, because I certainly always enjoy conversations with Kaelin. And if you would like to hear more conversations like that and more conversations with him, please do subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to turn on all of your notifications so you don't miss when the next videos comes out. Give this one a like, send it to a friend, to really anyone. Share it as much as you can so more people can know the truth. And of course, leave me all of your thoughts and comments and suggestions in the comments down below, and I will see you next time. Cheers.